serendipitous.
I don't call people kooks on here. Hello and welcome to the Hackaday podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Dan Maloney.
This is episode 248. We'll be looking at a Cthulhu clock radio transharmonium, the Thunderscan, and how to fill up in space. This week in the news, Voyager 1 in trouble as engineers scramble to debug issue with flight data systems. What's going on, basically, as far as we know, is that Voyager is just sending the same repeating data back to Earth, and that makes you think that something else is going on inside that doesn't look right.
Yeah, I like when there's Voyager news because there's stuff to learn, but it seems like anytime there's Voyager news now, it's, Voyager is, 50 years old, almost 50 years old, and it's in trouble, and da-da-da-da. And every time they seem to, drag it out of the fire, so let's hope they do it this time. It's the longest service call that you could possibly have, right? I mean, it's what now?
Yeah.
11 light hours away, I think?
22.
So round trip is 22?
No, round trip is 45.
Oh, geez. So it's really out there. Wow.
You fat finger one of your commands and it doesn't tell you made a syntax error for 45 minutes. So, yeah.
And I guess part of the problem is reading some of the comments on Maya's article. Part of the problem is that there's only one deep space station that can contact it and only one antenna, although they can kind of gang antennas at the Canberra site together. But it's got to be Canberra because Voyager went down below the plane of the ecliptic. So that means Australia now, because it's so far away, Australia is the only antenna that can see it, and only for about 6 hours a day or something like that. So you've got this, 22-hour latency. You've got the amount of data that has to get up there. You just have to send it in parts. So, 6 hours here, 6 hours there, and hope that it puts it all together when it gets up there.
Funny thing is this happened to Voyager 2 back in 2010. And what they did is they turned it off and on again. And they rebooted the thing and it squared it up and it started sending normal data. They've actually done the reset on Voyager 1 now and hasn't fixed the problem. So that kind of makes me worry a little bit. If turning it off and on again doesn't fix it, I don't think there's anything else you can do. Well, I have a little bit of an addendum to last week's podcast where Christina Panos and I were riffing on Lewin Day's article where he proposed a people getting sick on airplanes database. And we were thinking about, neither of us knew how air works on an airplane. And I was speculating that, it would have to heat up all that cold air from outside and, have to pressurize it because you're up there in the stratosphere. And some people set us straight in the comments and sent us off to a fantastic website that explains absolutely everything you could ever want to know about the Boeing 737. I'll put the link in the show notes, but it's b737.org.uk. And the short version of the story is the air that's in the cabin actually comes out of the jet engines before combustion, but it's at extremely high pressure and extremely high temperature. And they actually have to cool it down before they put it in the cabin. But there are also federal regulations that specify every person on the plane has to get basically 0.5 pound per minute of fresh air from outside the plane. And there's this whole incredible system. I went down the rabbit hole on this one. It's worth your time if you don't know how airplanes handle this. The upside of which is that a 737 with 200 people on board needs to push 1,400 cubic feet per minute through the plane all the time. And they actually do a little bit more by doing some recirculation, but basically the complete cabin is turned over in air every 3 minutes. So whatever you're worried about breathing other people's air on airplanes, it's probably not happening because the whole thing is being vented all the time. And you can read up on these super elaborate systems they have to keep the pressure inside the plane, which of course matters now that I think about it, because the pressure difference between inside and outside would stress the hull if it's changing and fluctuating all the time. Keeping the air flowing and the pressure equalized is not just a passengers are happy because their ears aren't popping as much kind of thing. It's actually also a structural integrity of the hull of the airplane sort of thing. And there's a whole bunch of equipment and fail-safes and multiple redundancies and all of that gone into it. It's really, really interesting read.
I think keeping the plane from exploding in midair is probably an essential part of the customer service experience too, you know.
My ears are
You're going to get some nasty letters.
My ears are popping. The hull's falling apart. Yeah, I think you're probably right. It's a little cold.
What's this giant whooshing sound I hear?
It was actually really neat because the guy who made the video on this website does tests on 737s and actually has a bit where he flies it up to altitude and shuts off the entire pressurization system just to see how quickly it leaks. And the answer is not that bad. Your ears will pop. You'll notice it. It's not like a rapid cabin depressurization effect. The packs, they call them, both of them go bad, then, you know, they still can probably get you down safe. If one of them goes bad, you don't even notice.
Interesting stuff.
Oh, the other one that I really loved is the airplanes have the 737 has a little pop valve on it, actually two of them, in case of overpressure. So, you know, you clearly don't want the hull getting collapsed in from outside, but you also don't want it popping, right? And so they have entirely redundant, entirely separate mechanical overpressure valves, like, you know, like anything we use to contain pressurized air.
Like the burst disc on a pressure cooker.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you can't overinflate a 737.
Good to know. News you can use.
Well, shall we head on off to What's That Sound?
Sure, well, let's do that.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
This week is a listen to the sound and guess what it is week. I feel super bad about last week. It was the sound of Clippy. You didn't get it.
I didn't get it.
Christina didn't get it. 6 people wrote in. Not a single one of them got it either. It was just the worst sound ever. So I hope to atone for it this week. Give it a listen.
It's unpleasant.
Okay.
I mean, you know, first thing I'm thinking of, it sounds like someone getting into a bag of Doritos or something, but I don't really think that's it.
Right.
Something with static discharge, maybe like atmospheric noise or something like that.
Interesting. Absolutely not.
But wrong.
It's something I can reproduce for you at my desk right now, even.
Okay. All right. Oh, now I got it. That's
Yeah, exactly. Oh, good.
Yeah. That sounds better when just sort of off mic, or, you know, the recorded one is kind of loud and yeah.
All right. Well, people out there listening, if you know what this is, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. Fill in the form, give us your handle and your best guess, and next week we will pick from the right answers and send someone a Hackaday podcast t-shirt. So let's head off to hacks. This week I want to start with the Transharmonium is a strange kind of radio musical instrument. This is an art project by Emily Francisco. It is the guts of a busted old piano, or at least the keyboard mechanism of a busted old piano, plus 43 clock radios that Emily bought from like Goodwills, and then she clipped the wire between the speaker and routed it through to a kind of handmade switch thing attached to the piano keys. So what you've got is a piano that can play 43 clock radios. Because this is art, of course, she has these exquisitely detailed instructions for both operating the thing, maintaining it. She says it's meant to travel, which if you have a look at it, it is hard to believe because it is like this tangled wire Cthulhu mess of like, I don't know what, clock radios all over the place spewing out of a piano. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, so one reason I love this, of course, is because it's a crazy art piece, but the other is for the operation and maintenance manual, which she gives to the galleries that want to show this thing, because it shows all of the work you have to do and all the things you have to think about to make a kind of crazy, sprawling, gargantuan art piece like this behave right when it's installed and maintained by, by just kind of normal art gallery people, not, tech nerds who want to take apart transistor radios. Anyway, one of the things that's really neat about this is she has explicit instructions for how to tune all of the radios. You start with the C, and that has to be tuned to the lowest classical music station on the dial, which, at FM it's always around like FM 89 or 90, 91. And then you tune all the white keys to the next stations as you go up the frequency band, and then all the black keys are tuned to static in between. So they are all playing static. And what I really love about this is that, of course, it's not playing from one clock radio in any given location, but rather 43 different little crappy clock radio speakers spread out all across the stage, all around you. Must be absolutely hilarious to play it live.
And every time you play it, you're going to get something different. It's not like you can press a key and say, okay, that's my middle G or whatever. It's going to be whatever happens to be on the radio at that time. So it could be a commercial. It could be a guy talking about, the weather or the traffic or whatever. So yeah, I can get the art part of it. It's, it's ephemeral. It's, there's got to be fancy words for it, but basically what it is, sampling what's out there in the ether at any given time. It's kind of cool like that. I think the the Cthulhu mess that she referred to, which is a great way to describe it, is part of the art too. I mean, there seems to be some structure to that. I think artfully arranging its gigantic mess of wires that just go everywhere, and that's part of the presentation.
She chose kind of a deliberately beat down looking piano to use too. I mean, it's really, there's definitely an aesthetic going on here as well. But I think it must be fun to play. Like you mentioned, it's random stuff on the radio. So you could like go up there and just kind of start mashing down keys till you hear something you like and see if anything works with anything else. It won't ever be the same again, but that's part of the fun, right?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of my daughter likes this Ghost Hunter show, and they use this thing where, I forget what it's called, but it basically scans through a bunch of radio frequencies really, really rapidly, and the idea is the spirits are supposed to stop it at a certain point, and you'll hear, whatever's being said on the radio at that time, and somehow spirits have control of this. So it just goes, golf, weather, and it just kind of goes through these, things, and it's ridiculous. And you think you hear something like, oh, it definitely said my name. Can't you hear that? And like, and, it doesn't say anything. So it's kind of the same thing almost. You could probably, the ghost will probably press the right key at the right time to say something important.
Two more sweet little tidbits from her maintenance manual. One is she, of course, has instructions for replacing radios because these are old busted clock radios, and it includes such important points as it has to be a clock radio that turns on as soon as you turn it on, as soon as you apply power, because these things all have to be working, right? And she gives instructions for the museum staff to splice it in and put in new spade connectors and all of that, and label it with silver Sharpie because they all are labeled. Each radio is labeled with its key, right? But then the other thing is she mentions that if you power the device on at midnight, they'll all have the correct time on them.
I was going to say.
Which made, because I was thinking, oh my God, this is going to be, you don't want the museum staff to have to set 43 clock radios. And so I love that she's thought of that last little detail, which is that if you really care about them having the right time, you sneak into the gallery in the middle of the night and you turn them on at midnight.
Because that would just drive me crazy if they had all different times. I wouldn't be able to work in that art gallery. Well, kind of keeping on the same theme. Nah, it's not even close. It has something to do with radio. Let's put it that way. Modern spark gap transmitter uses a rotary gap. Spark gap, that's the way we used to do radio before radio was radio. I mean, that was, when we were first learning about, when you had Marconi and that whole crew, doing the radio experiments. Everything was spark gaps. That was the only way to get a message into the air for a long time. And radio amateurs, way, way, way back then, 100 years or more ago now, had to build their own spark gap transmitters. Doing so today is maybe not so legal, but I think probably Joe Smith, which I suspect might be an alias, it gets away with it here, I think, because it seems pretty low power and just using it sort of as an educational demonstration sort of project. The idea here is that he's using mostly car parts, a car ignition coil as a source of the high voltage to generate the spark. He's got a tank circuit with hand-wound coils. He's got this driver end that's a completely different generation of electronics with MOSFETs and transistors and signal generator to actually clock this whole thing. Basically what he does is he has a signal generator that's running anywhere from 10 hertz to maybe 200 hertz square wave, puts that through a Morse key. It's a vibroplex key, I think that's called a bug, basically. So you hit it one way and you get a dit, you hit it the other way, you get a da. And so that interrupts the square wave that then goes into this driver circuit, which drives the ignition coil, and then the high voltage goes into the spark gap and the tuned tank circuit, and then out through the antenna. Hopefully he's not getting out very far, and because this is going to be broadband, interference probably across a wide swath of the spectrum. But it's interesting that he actually manages to receive it on another old-timey radio, but one with actual electronics in it. And it's an old Drake communications receiver, I think. And it sounds actually pretty good, and it's very readable. You got to know Morse code, of course, because that's all you can do with a spark gap transmitter, but it actually works. And this is an offshoot, I guess, of a project where he used one of those electronic fly swatters, the bug zapper things that you just wave around and you catch the bugs and then you smell burning bug for the next 2 days. He uses one of those as the high voltage section. And then he decided, well, can you do with it an ignition coil? Yes, you can. Some commenters did take him to task for saying that it was a rotary spark gap. I mean, a rotary spark gap is a big motor driving. It looks like a Frankenstein sort of, Frankenstein's laboratory sort of thing, where it's this, big contacts are whirling around an electric motor and using that to, interrupt a high voltage source and create a spark gap. This is simulating that using the square wave from a signal generator and then boosting it up with a ignition coil. It's pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, I think everyone in the comments is focused on whether this is legal or not. I don't know. I seem to vaguely remember that there is some exception for experimental transmissions or like historic reenactments or something. Do not do this and then come calling to me, because I'm going to claim I never said this. I'm going to erase the podcast from the internet. But I vaguely remember. If anyone out there can back me up on this, that would be lovely. Or better yet, if anyone out there can say, Elliot, you're full of it and it's absolutely illegal to do so, even for just a quick test. That would be good to know too. Bring sources, because I couldn't find anything more than hearsay in the comments. So let's get some solid citations for this one.
And the other thing with the FCC, I mean, at least here, I'm sure it's different in other parts of the world, but the FCC, if they come knocking on your door because you're doing something like this, realistically, they have to knock on everybody's door and say, those switch mode power supplies that you have, those LED lights that you have, the micro inverters in your solar system that you have that we approved and said they were good to go, but they generate, an amazing amount of QRM interference. To be fair, they would need to go around and correct all the ills that they've let sort of pass, and increased our noise floor. So it's very difficult to hear anything if you're in a suburban neighborhood or an urban environment. But, that's not an argument that's going to fly when the FCC comes knocking.
True. And this is certainly not legal advice, but it is the case that the FCC isn't out there looking for people all the time. And instead, what happens is you interfere with someone else's use of the spectrum. They complain to the FCC, and then the FCC comes out and gets you. So if you did it once, I don't think there's any way they'd find you. this is not legal advice.
I am not a lawyer. And I actually had an experience with a spark gap, an unintentional spark gap transmitter that I created. Back when I lived in Connecticut, we had an electric fence around our chickens because we had lots of bears and they got hungry. So the electric fence, on my ham radio, every second or whatever it was,
Oh, no way.
I could hear this little tick, and I was like, "What the hell is that?" And I finally traced it down. There was a piece of grass or twig or something like that that had grown from the outside of the fence through the fence, and had touched one of the conductors, or almost touched one of the conductors. And every time the fence fired, it was making a 1/4-inch long spark that was transmitting, broadband. I could hear it. I'd spin my dial, and it would be everywhere. Like,
right?
Geez, what is this? Well, that's what it is. It was a spark gap. I didn't mean to. I fixed it.
That, of course, gives you the diagnostic for whether you have a spark gap causing your problems, right? If the noise is everywhere, it's probably a rogue spark somewhere. That's actually totally useful to think about.
Yeah.
My next hack is a video from Les Wright, who is living my laser dreams. This is homemade Ramen Laser is shaken, not stirred. He really is getting to play with all of the esoteric lasers out there and making videos about it. And I am so jealous. It's so awesome. And this time he comes up with a laser I've never even heard of, which is a Raman laser. And this is Raman, like Raman scattering and Raman spectroscopy. So what exactly is Raman scattering? It is what happens when light hits a molecule, causes parts of that molecule, some of the chemical bonds, to vibrate. They then emit a different wavelength of light, where the difference between the incoming wavelength and the outgoing wavelength tells you something about the chemical bond in question. And that's how it's used for Raman spectroscopy. There are some chemicals and some excitation light frequency combinations that actually make a shorter wavelength come out than the one that's going in. And that's particularly interesting because these can then cause kind of a cascade, and that light will wiggle another molecule, and that light will wiggle another molecule. And that should make you think about these kind of funny laser cascades that make lasers work. And that's what's going on here. Les is pumping a vial of some kind of creepy chemical, dimethyl sulfoxide, with his laser and hitting it so that it, through Raman scattering, in particular the kind that puts out a lower wavelength of light, then turns it into a laser. And what's interesting about Raman scattering lasers is that because there is a wide variety of chemicals slash solid slash crystals slash whatever you can put inside the resonating chamber, and various wavelengths of light that you can hit it with, there are a tremendously broad range of colored lasers you can get out of this thing. And that's what's really fun here. He's hitting it with a green 532 and out is coming 628 red. But had he used different chemicals and a different pumping laser, he could have gotten, entirely different spectra out of it. So really, really fun, and just the kind of weirdest laser I've ever heard of.
When I was writing this up, I wanted to put something in about C.V. Raman himself. He's at the center of the origin stories for a bunch of different real sci-fi kind of stuff. Obviously Raman lasers, but also, like you said before, Raman spectroscopes or Raman spectroscopy. To me, that's the very definition of sufficiently advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic. He's the magician behind that. You point a spectroscope at a substance, a surface, and it tells you what it is. You could just, by analyzing the scattering of light by different bonds, you can then do a little artificial intelligence sort of lookup and to say, okay, that's polystyrene, or that's water, or what's in a paint that you put on your desktop, or anything at all. And to me, that's just absolute magic. And this guy was just looking at the scattering of light. And the story goes, he was on a boat someplace. He was taking a boat ride someplace, and he was looking at the water and saying, well, why is the water blue? being a physicist with a properly prepared mind, he took it down the rabbit hole and came up with this. I mean, he didn't invent the Raman laser. This was, decades later, but his principles, the Raman scattering and stimulated Raman scattering, are central to this, and he's the guy who made it happen. And he earned a Nobel Prize like 2 years later, which I find amazingly fast. Usually Nobel Prizes are like, a decade, 2 decades. Now, 2 years later, bam, he's got his Nobel. Kind of amazing guy. Okay, next up for me, cheap computer PSU puts on weight with a box of iron. I mean, we all kind of maybe mentally associate quality with the weight of something. It's something that's lightweight and cheap and flimsy feeling is going to get judged in your mind as one thing versus something that's got some heft and some gravity in it, And I think this is one of the things that a Redditor named Reddit Cringe 990 found out when a power supply just a PC power supply, took it apart to see what was inside, and the answer is not a hell of a lot. There was pretty much nothing in this power supply that you would expect a PC power supply to have. No overcurrent protection, no inrush protection. There's a bunch of unpopulated spots on the PC board in this power supply. They just were never populated, and it's things that you really want to have a power supply to have. But what it did have, which most PC power supplies don't have, is a strange-looking plastic box that kind of looks like a transformer. They even went to the expense of putting the telltale yellow polyester tape on the outside of this thing. However, when you take it down and look inside, it is literally filled with a plastic bag of iron filings or some sort of dense substance to give this very flimsy, very dodgy power supply a little bit of heft. Hats off for clever, I guess, but geez, having something like this end up in one of your PCs, I'm thinking is just dial 911 and wait for the PC to catch on fire, and you can dial the final one and get the fire department there in a hurry. To me, the iron filings are bad enough, but the real pièce de résistance is the cooling fan branded cooling fan that sits at the back of this thing. It's just a box of junk, and the Reddit community just took it apart.
And on top of all that, of course, it's probably not legal. Like, it certainly hasn't been inspected by any of the relevant inspection things. Like, it doesn't have any of those funny little regulatory marks on it, who wrote this? I guess Tom wrote this one up, and he links to this fantastic piece that Bob Badley wrote for us back in 2018, where he goes through all of the funny marks you see on an actual power supply, where it says which country has looked at it and, what it's good for, positive tip, negative tip, the whole thing. It's a really nice article. And you look at this one, it's got some kind of hieroglyphics on it if you look at the pictures, but they're not any of the real ones. It's like... I guess it suggests that you could recycle it and that you shouldn't throw it in the trash, but then there's none of the safety ones on there. And so, yeah, well, at least it's labeled correctly.
It boggles my mind at how much effort people will go to no effort.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, there is so much work in here that could have been translated into actual engineering.
They had to find and bag up that batch of iron filings.
And what is it? I mean, it's probably toxic. It might be radioactive. Who knows, right? I mean, it's where did it come from? That's gross.
Probably it. They're probably disposing of some toxic waste that they need to get rid of. And the cheapest way to do it is to put it in 300-gram bags and ship it to suckers who will buy your power supply.
And, this thing probably is putting out more RF farther than that spark grab transmitter we were talking about before. So if the FCC wants to come knocking for my spark gap transmitter, I'm just going to send them this link. Like, go find this guy. He's got this power supply. I'm sure that's worse.
Next up, the Thunderscan, the wild 1980s product that turned a printer into a scanner. This is a neat write-up and teardown by Beef Chicken Industries. That's fun to say. Of the Thunderscan, which was... You know how old school dot matrix printers had cartridges that ran an ink ribbon around slowly? So this is a scanner. It looks like it's a 1 pixel reflective scanner head that would fit into the printer ribbon cartridge for an old Macintosh image writer printer, and basically just use the fact that it gives you kind of an XY mechanism, and this thing had a 1 pixel scanner in it to slowly scan a document. And if that sounds slow to you, it was horrendously slow to scan something this way. But back in the day, you had no choice. The device itself is kind of a bit of a hack. It was cheap and probably the best resolution you could get. The trade-off is that it took forever to scan a page, but that didn't stop people. Back when the Mac was new, it had the best resolution graphics out there on the market, and like the first really decent Paint app, and so you really wanted to be able to scan in images to this thing. Anyway, here Beef Chicken Industries is tearing this thing apart, and it comes with a converter box, which is found to be kind of nothing more than a cable adapter. And the scan head itself is tremendously minimalist. There is not a single microcontroller involved. In fact, all it is an optical sensor and then a voltage to frequency converter. And he's tipped off to how strange this thing is because the connection to the computer is only through the serial port and only through the external baud rate signal of the serial port. So these old serial ports apparently had an external clock you could put in, and that is the only connection to the computer. What it's doing is reading the brightness level. The voltage to frequency converter is then turning this into clock frequencies that ranged from like 2.5 kilohertz for black to 50 hertz for white. And then the computer on the receiving end is getting its clock line toggled and only has to keep track of how frequently characters, and I guess this is whatever ASCII 0 is, are coming across the serial line, and it uses that to figure out how bright the particular pixel it's looking at is. That's an insane device. You can read more about the software side of it, a write-up by Andy Hertzfeld. I'll throw that link in the show notes as well. But I just love the intense minimalism and kind of reusing of existing hardware that people are likely to have that's going on here.
I'm just fascinated by that PC board. All through hole, obviously. It's a component you don't see anymore. The Mylar caps, there's a polystyrene cap there, the carbon composition resistors where you can actually read the color codes because there's good contrast between the body color and the stripes, and then this big can in there, a couple of dips. There's an op amp up there. It's just gorgeous construction, and it just takes you back. But whatever the sensor is at the working end of this, you don't see the the window that I presume is on the top of it. But what 6-8 leads, maybe something like that. There's got to be an LED or a couple of LEDs and a photodiode or something like that. I'd like to have
exactly
more,
what it is.
I'd love to have more information about that, what that part number is, and what you could do with it now.
Oh, that is the Agilent Technologies HEDS 1500 655 nanometer precision optical reflective sensor.
Bam! How about that?
It's a red LED and a photodiode.
Nice.
But a precision one.
But a precision one. And very fancy.
Back in the day, I think it actually was. And
yeah,
actually Beef Chicken mentions that it is probably the most expensive part of the whole build, which I guess when the rest of the build is 8 other parts, it pretty much has to be. But really neat device, and just like kind of the super minimalistic approach to scanning is really interesting to me.
This kind of strikes me as before there were 3D printers that we could use as a generic 3-axis motion control platform. Really, the only thing that moved that was sort of computer-centric was the printer. So, okay, yeah, take it apart or add accessories to it and make it do something useful that needs to move. That was an interesting hack for the time.
And the rest is a simple matter of software.
One waves their hands.
I just literally waved my hands. You could hear that? I did literally wave my hands.
One must. Okay, next up for me, NASA blames probe chute failure on wire labels. Close call on this one. This was OSIRIS-REx, and it's only just coming to light that that could have been a crater in the Utah desert very, very easily, given the magnitude of a problem that was discovered after the fact, which I assume was in some sort of after-action review of some sort to see exactly how it went. When a mission like this goes, and for those who aren't familiar, this is the mission that returns the sample of the asteroid, put it in a capsule and shot that into the atmosphere and re-entered over California somewhere and eventually touched down in the Utah desert. I think at the Dugway Proving Grounds, which is a great place for doing these things. Easy to see something that stands out. And this certainly does, because the beautiful orange and white parachute opened up and it came down and it floated down, and everybody was really happy that the sample of asteroid came back from this billion-something dollar mission. But on closer examination, it did not go very well. What was supposed to happen is at something like 35 kilometers high or something like that, a drogue chute is supposed to come out. And a drogue isn't really a parachute per se. It's just to add some drag and kind of stabilize the spacecraft as it goes through the thicker part of the atmosphere and decelerate it some. Well, the drogue chute never came out. That usually spells disaster, because the drogue chute is really what needs to, like I said, it needs to stabilize it. So it could very easily have started to spin and yaw and pitch and everything else. And that would have been a big problem for when the main chute came out. However, the main chute came out and did its job, and did the drogue chute's job too. And the parachute came down. The reason for the failure is really, really interesting and so mundane that it almost is comical. Someone labeled the wires wrong. It was miscommunication. Yeah, miscommunication between two different teams on what the word main meant. One team took it as meaning the main chute. The other took it as meaning the main charge to cut the drogue free. So basically, there's cord cutters and cable cutters that are pyrotechnic devices that basically guillotine a wiring harness, or in this case, the probably nylon ropes that attach the drogue to the spacecraft. When you've got to cut the drogue away, you would fire pyrotechnics and bam, the guillotine comes down. The lines are passing through the lumen of the guillotine, and then they get cut and the drogue flies away. Well, what happened in this case is because of the labeling or mislabeling problem, the wiring harnesses got switched so that the pyrotechnics for the guillotine were connected to the pyrotechnics for the hatch cover for the main chute. So when the sequencer came along and said, time to deploy the drogue chute, it cut the lines for the drogue chute while it's still packed in its canister. Aww. And then later on, when the main chute was supposed to go, it popped the cover for the canister off and the drogue chute goes whoop, so it's out somewhere in Utah or Nevada. And then the main chute came out and did its job, despite the fact that it didn't have the drogue there to begin to stabilize things. So real close call, real interesting failure mode, and plenty of lessons to learn. I don't know. Someone is probably really embarrassed that this got through a whole bunch of design reviews, but space is hard, and coming back home is even harder. So I'm not casting aspersions here. This is a hard thing to do correctly, and the fact that they managed to get it done in the wrong way speaks a lot to redundancy and good engineering, and a hell of a lot of luck too.
Labeling anything main is probably just asking for trouble, right? Like, is it the main chute, or is it the main pyrotechnic, or is it the, who knows? And as someone who never takes good enough notes on my own wiring on contraptions that I make, I definitely feel for them here. And you who hasn't switched up TX and RX wires on a serial connection, you can cast the first stone.
Cast the first stone.
Because that's an even odds bet, basically, on whether you get it right or wrong, whether you remember to cross them, or whether the engineer on the other side remembered to label them correctly. That's a coin flip as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, but that really does make the case for more explicit labeling on things. And I guess that's where NASA's going to take the review with this, probably. Would not be surprised to see NASA come out with a, all cable labels must be unique and ambiguous, so this can never happen again sort of thing. And, that kind of learning through experience and, continuous improvement is what gets your spaceships to be more reliable in the end.
Yeah, and I mean, somebody in the comment mentioned who do you fire? Do you fire the person who put it together? Do you fire the person who designed it? Do you fire the program manager, or the
Nobody.
person who decided to make the? Well, the point was, there's so many different ways that this could have been stopped. Could someone have designed a wiring harness where the two connectors weren't interchangeable? Yeah, easily. Could
Sure.
someone have designed a wiring harness that was too short to reach one? Or a whole lot of extra length if you plugged it into the wrong connector, and you'd look at it and you're like, nah, that ain't right.
That would be good.
That's a lot of times I'm relying on, oh, well, let's see, this wire looks like it's got a bend here, and it's got the shadow of a cable tie that was here that must go over this way. Yeah, okay. You get the wiring right that way based on sort of physical clues, but it sounds like they made it possible to screw up like this, and that's what they need to learn from this, is how to make it harder to screw up, because people are going to screw up. And there are always going to be human factors, and I think that's where they need to concentrate their effort, and I think that's probably what they're doing.
My first quick hack comes from Chris. It is LED art project is geometrically beautiful, and this is really cool. It's a glowy piece of wall art on its own, but what's really cool is the way he designed it, which was to write some software that generated algorithmic patterns for him to then fill with the LEDs in question. You can run it yourself and make similar but different, entirely random artwork. What I think's cool here is that the random generator generates a bunch of designs and lets the human kind of go through them and pick out the coolest looking ones, and that's how he did this. The other thing that's cool about this blog is that it's in Spanish, and Chris is doing this because he's learning Spanish and just wanted practice, so he gets a twofer by documenting his projects in Spanish. Next up, Crouch 9706, hilarious security flaw in Counter-Strike 2 is now patched. If you get reported in Counter-Strike 2, apparently some part of the system interprets your name as if it were HTML. And so you could put in images by naming yourself, less than image something greater than, or you could redirect people to your website by putting it in there with a link, and use this to de-anonymize people by picking up their IP addresses, etc., etc. Apparently, this has now been patched, but why they were parsing people's usernames as HTML is beyond me. Always sanitize your input, kids. Last up, Raspberry Pi Foundation. Raspberry Pi changes hats. So this is the news of the newest revision to the Raspberry Pi hat spec that is hardware attached on top. It's actually an acronym. This is now Hat Plus. You can read all about it in a PDF that is linked in this article, but the long and the short of it is that because the newer Raspberry Pi computers have a standby state, all compliant hats now have to be able to run on only the 5-volt rail, absent the 3.3 voltage rail. And they've also kind of cleaned up the spec for the EEPROM content that has to come on top. And the coolest part about this is there is an allowance in the spec for stacking hats upon hats. So you can make a hat stack. I guess you have to know which one's the top hat.
Top hat.
I'm just keep telling hat jokes until you do your quick hacks.
Fair enough. Okay, first up for me is a ham radio answering machine. This is the Boondock Echo that Gabe Emerson from the Save It for Parts channel on YouTube took with him on a trip to Death Valley and used in a way that more correctly sort of reflects the original intention for using the Boondock Echo. I've got one sitting on my desk right now that I use in a completely different way. I'm part of the beta test as Gabe is, and I'm using it to listen to the scanner and intercept any calls that might be in my neighborhood or in neighborhoods of people that I know and love. He's using it more as an offline capture for ham radio transmissions that can be uploaded to the internet once you return to civilization. So that was a pretty cool demo of what the machine is actually intended to do. Next up is, when is a 6502 not quite a 6502? Well, when it's got bright white markings on it that really look suspicious and don't look anything like any chip markings you've ever seen before. It was supposed to be a 65CO2, a lower power version of the venerable 6502 chip that just was not cutting the mustard when it was actually used in a circuit. Interestingly enough, the two white markings were easily dissolved with a little dab of acetone, so they were paint rather than laser markings. And again, this is one of those situations where someone's putting an awful lot of effort into putting no effort into something. And last up, fast paper tape for the nuclear family. This is by the Chernobyl family, who go through all of the technology that was present at the time of the Chernobyl accident, so mid-80s, and a lot of it coming right from the Chernobyl plant. This one is a high-speed storage device on paper tape. Actually, a lot of people probably haven't seen paper tape readers and writers before, but they are somewhat stately in the progression of the tape through the reader. This one doesn't want any of that, and the tape just zooms through the reader. In the Soviet Union, paper cut kills you. Nuts. Get nowhere near that thing.
If you need the data throughput. All right, that brings us to our Can't Miss articles. These are long-form pieces written by our fantastic Hackaday writing staff. This week, I wanted to pick Tech in Plain Sight Superglue, a write-up by Richard Baguli of the history of Superglue. And I thought this was really cool because it was one of those kind of serendipitous inventions, but then also you have to kind of realize when you've got serendipity and roll with it. And so this is the story of how chemist Harry Coover was trying to develop a clear plastic using cyanoacrylates, and they were sticking to everything. He couldn't get them out of the molds. And years later, 6 years later, he's looking for something to glue something together, and he's like, in his chemist mind, wait a minute, I used to have something sticky, and goes back and reinvestigates the use of cyanoacrylates, which we now think of as superglue, to stick things together. 1951, he is starting to work on superglue. He gets it patented shortly thereafter. It's being sold by the Eastman Kodak Company, where he was working as a chemist, in 1958, and it's basically still around today, and in a kind of a mind-bogglingly wide variety of viscosities and whatever else, but it all kind of goes back to the same basic chemistry from back then. Dr. Coover went on to become, I think, like vice president of Eastman Kodak and get a mazillion patents and stuff. This guy was a tremendously successful industrial chemist. But I think no matter how amazing your career is, if you end up inventing superglue, you're going to be stuck with that one for a while. There's nothing else you could do to top that.
What surprises me about this, or what surprised me when I first wrote about this, I'll include the link to the article. I mentioned briefly cyanoacrylates, along with other glues that are sort of, workshop handy stuff, sort of the science of sticking things together in general. But what surprised me about this is, and I didn't really realize it, was that this is essentially an unpolymerized plastic. That's all it is. This is just monomers that are hanging out and not doing anything in the tube, but as soon as you let them go and provide them with a little moisture, basically, is not really an accelerator. I guess it's not really a catalyst either, but it's the initiator, we'll call it, that these monomers just start to find each other and connect to each other and form these long chains of polymers that then have both adhesiveness and cohesiveness. So cohesiveness is how well each molecule sticks to each other, and then adhesiveness is how well the molecules stick to other things, like your eyelids. Which I vividly remember my dad, this was a long time ago, when cyanoacrylates were just becoming, like, with the crazy glue guy, with the construction guy with the hard hat on TV with the cheap commercials. My dad got a hot glue gun, just, regular hot glue gun. And my mom saw it and goes, "Oh my God, is this going to be one of those things where the kids glue their eyes together?" And he was like, "Well, Maybe. I mean, if they're stupid, I suppose they could put the screaming hot glue in their eyes and glue them together. But it's not the stuff you're thinking of, no. How quickly we all learned that, that you needed to have acetone around because if you glued your fingers together, you could use acetone to get them apart. The number of things that CA glues now are useful for is just mind-boggling. It's plenty of applications for just regular adhesives. There's thread lockers that are CA-based. There's surgical glues. They'll just glue together skin with CA. Or if you're, a little more commando, you might just go grab your bottle of CA glue and put that in your cut. And I can't say that I haven't done that a few times myself. It does sting a bit, though. It's quite hot. And a little spicy. But yeah, there's so many things that CA glues are good for that's hard to imagine the world without them. The science of how they work is really fascinating.
Yeah, I'm glad you said water because that reminded me, it's water that kicks off the reaction and then, these things bond, it gives off a hydroxyl, that gets to the next one. It's this like cascade, which is why buy super glue in small tubes because it always absorbs water from the atmosphere. Or follow the tip of Jan W., who puts his CA glue in a tightly screwed marmalade jar filled with desiccant. As long as you can keep the super glue from getting to water, it's not going to harden up on you. And so if you could keep it in as dry an atmosphere as you can, you may be able to keep that bottle of super glue alive long enough to actually use it all for once. I know I never have, but... I can also confirm that super glue stings when used on cuts. I've had it used both by professionals on a cut on me and I've used it myself on my own cuts, and it's absolutely lovely.
Yeah, once you get past the sting though, it's a good cure.
Well, if you can hold the cut together well enough, really hard, and then just glue the outside, you can actually, get very little of it inside you, which is the way I like to do it. Only works for kind of really nice, clean cuts.
True, and it is non-toxic. I mean, but the medical grade stuff obviously has to go through, all kinds of approvals and stuff like that. So we're not advising that you go down to the dollar store and get the super glue and put it on you. We're not saying that you should do that. I'm not saying that I don't do that.
I think I would say you can do that.
You weren't a lawyer before, but you're a doctor now.
I mean. Good point. Maybe I won't say that.
Okay, for me, the can't miss article of the week is Artemis's next giant leap orbital refueling. This is funny because I was just talking with someone on the Boondock Echo project, actually. Have we ever covered what the Artemis mission is going to be like a big overview of the Artemis mission? The answer, as far as I can tell, is no, but we have kind of tackled pieces of it, and that's what Tom Nardi does in this article. The big question mark in Artemis, and for anyone who doesn't know, the Artemis program is NASA's next moon mission. We're going to get people back to the moon, first in orbit around it, and then eventually with landers. There's a whole bunch of unproven technology, and I'm getting a lot of a kind of an Apollo vibe to this time because of Artemis. I grew up with a steady diet of Apollo and Gemini and Mercury, and they were formative. Actually, Mercury was a little before my time, but they were very formative to me, and watching those missions and seeing them prove out every step along the way. They didn't know, first of all, that people could survive going to space, so that's what Mercury was for. Could people actually stand to be in a Volkswagen-sized spacecraft for 2 weeks? Well, that was Gemini. That was for. Could they actually rendezvous and dock? That was also a big thing that Gemini proved. Nobody had any idea. Would you be able to get a fully fueled rocket out of the gravity well of Earth and on a way to the moon? You had to prove that out too. And this kind of is like that. It's going to take an awful lot of fuel to get to the moon and get back. Yes, we did that already by launching an enormous rocket with a tiny, tiny payload at the top, basically 3 astronauts and a little bit of gear to keep them alive. With the exception of the 3 astronauts and the very, very tip of that rocket, nothing came back. Everything was left along the way, either dropped into the ocean or slammed into the moon or was left there or went off into orbit or something like that. We're doing Artemis completely different. We want to have reusability. We want to have a permanent presence on the moon and in lunar orbit. So that's an entirely different set of specifications. We can't just build a Saturn V. Also, we can't build a Saturn V. We've lost the ability to build a Saturn V anymore. So we have to use new rockets, but we also have to use rockets that are capable of returning. And the next big question we have to answer is it possible to transfer massive quantities of cryogenic propellants while in free fall? And that's basically what we're talking about, because you can't just get all the fuel up there at once. The landers that they've proposed are enormous. I mean, you can't. I had a hard time finding the astronauts for scale in the photographs, especially for the Starship. They're comically small compared to the Starship lander that SpaceX is planning on putting on the moon. The Blue Moon lander is considerably smaller, maybe about half the size, but still enormous, and probably, 2.5, 3 times the size of a lunar module. They're talking about being able to get 100 tons of cargo onto the moon, in which case you would be able to set up permanent settlements or semi-permanent settlements. And like I said, that's going to take an enormous amount of fuel. They're talking about probably 15 flights of very, very large rockets that are specially modified for propellant storage to get enough propellant up there for the translunar ejection. And then again, Artemis 3 will launch with the Orion capsule on top of the SLS. They'll all go up to the near rectilinear halo orbit, NRHO, and end up on the surface of the moon and then return safely in the Orion capsule. So all of this is super, super complicated, but nobody knows if any of this is possible. It's one of those things where if the laws of physics don't forbid it, it's just an engineering problem. But just an engineering problem can be quite a big step. So they've got to do a whole bunch of work to see what it's like to move cryogenic fluids around in free fall. Is that going to require special pumps? Is that going to require standardization in the plumbing? Obviously, is going to be one of the things that has to be looked at. There's a whole lot of questions that need to be answered on a pretty tight schedule if Artemis 3 is supposed to launch with people and get them on the moon by, 2025, I think they wanted to do. So it doesn't seem realistic, but maybe it is and maybe it isn't. But anyways, it's good to see. It's that good vibe of Apollo. We don't know what we don't know at this point, so let's go find out and let's launch some rockets and try to do these things.
That's putting a good spin on it. I saw this and I was like, what the heck are they even thinking? I actually did a little digging. There's a really neat video by Smarter Every Day about this. There's also some information out there from NASA. The tricky part of this is that rectilinear halo orbit, and rectilinear means it's 90 degrees. It's going over the north and south pole of the moon. And so if you think about it, the moon's in the same orbital plane as the Earth. It doesn't just have to get to the moon like Apollo's did. It has to get to the moon and then get into this funny orbit that's not in the same plane as everything else is orbiting, but is actually 90 degrees to that. So it has to burn a heck of a lot of fuel to dock up with this lunar gateway, which, that hasn't even been tested yet. I mean, Lunar Gateway is in this crazy rectilinear orbit because that way it can always see the Earth and it passes over the South Pole where they want to do this landing. So I guess they kind of have to do that to maintain communications and to get down to the South Pole where they want to land. But that is kind of what's necessitating all this extra fuel, plus also, I guess, the tremendously expanded scale of the payload they want to bring out there. But 15 rockets just full of fuel to fuel this thing up so that it can do it is insane to me. And 15 is kind of crazy. The minimum. They're saying more than 15. And when Tom was pitching this piece, he was saying this is really, kind of a choke point right now, whether they can do this fueling in space that they've never tested before. And so it's kind of interesting because this whole big architectural thing, we want to have a rendezvous point around the moon because we want to get to the South Pole, then kind of cascades downward to, holy crap, we need to launch 15, 20 rockets up there to get enough fuel onto this thing. And we've never tried refueling in space ever before. Like, it's just really interesting how it all kind of focuses down on this one kind of untested point at the moment. I'm sure once they get this running, it'll be the next untested point, and that's fine by me too.
that goalpost will move.
Exactly. So, but this is kind of the next really big hurdle, and like Tom says, this is something that they have to do. There's no way to do this mission plan to the moon without doing in-orbit propellant transfers. So they are gonna make in-orbit propellant transfers work, or nobody's going to the moon with this much payload. Just period.
Right. The only thing we would be able to do would be basically to recreate Apollo and land somewhere near the equator, and we did that. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt. So
It's still kind of cool.
we don't. It's cool. Oh, it's cool. If you could do it with 100 tons but then you wouldn't. You wouldn't be able to do it with 100 tons. You would be able to do it with 3 people in a tiny little spaceship and return them just to say that you left some footprints behind. Which is, and I don't like to minimize the accomplishments of Apollo, but basically that's the reason we didn't go any further is because we had beat the Russians to the moon and end of story. Okay, move on to the next thing.
But if you're running 20 fuel ships up there just to refuel the thing, you could also just run those 20 ships to the moon, each with their payload. They wouldn't have to have people on them. You could even probably get away with even less propellant, because you could take the slow path to the moon for all the ones that are just carrying stuff, and you only need to go fast when you got people in the car. So I don't know. Anyway, this is the way they're running it, and I'm not willing to armchair quarterback this one. I don't know enough.
I'm pleased that there's a big unifying engineering project that's sort of out there. I don't feel like it's got the same sort of consciousness impact that Apollo did. I mean, everybody in my circles everybody knew what was going on, followed it on the news, and and knew the names of the astronauts, and knew the names of, that things happened in Huntsville, things happened in Houston, things happened in Cape Canaveral. You knew all the details, and I don't feel like people have quite that amount of ownership here as they did back in the 60s, but we got a lot more distractions. There wasn't a lot going on back then, so watch Star Trek or watch Apollo. I appreciate the fact that they've got a big unanswered question right now, and they are coming up with ways to answer that. And I've got a feeling it's answerable.
I like that take, actually. Here's the next hurdle, we'll solve it. Here's the next hurdle, we'll solve it. Whereas I look at this and I'm like, this whole thing is so overly ambitious, it's really mental. And I'm not sure that's wrong either. I'm sure that this is the most complicated way to go to the moon.
Yeah, and Apollo was ambitious for 1962 technology.
But it was the simplest way to go to the moon.
It was the simplest way, and it was the easiest way to get a win, and it worked.
That wraps it up for this week's Hackaday podcast. Thanks very much for listening. If you want to follow the links, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. And if you see anything cool or do anything cool, send us a line, tips@hackaday.com. And until next week,
keep on hacking.
Well, I've gone on a ramble. All right, my next hack is a video. I don't know. That doesn't make any sense. I guess they were using this one, I think. So where does that leave me? Sorry, man, I'm having a meltdown.
I don't know if we wrote that up or...
I think we did, actually. Hackaday's the only website I look at. I'm certain it must have been on Hackaday. Probably going to cut this out. And that, I think, is that.
You get to spell Cthulhu, though.